Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Winecast. At the request of a viewer, I'm taking a stab at a wine region that I've wanted to do for a while, Chile. I'm excited to talk about Chilean wines because they're widely available, have been developing a better and better reputation for quality, but are still a great bargain and should definitely be on every wine drinker's radar. There's a lot to explore when it comes to Chile, and future casts will hopefully be able to do more justice to some of Chile's wine regions individually. But by the end of this cast, you should come away with a good idea about what grows there, where it grows, and what to look for if Chilean wine is new to you, or maybe if you just want to get to know it a little bit better. So let's get started. Vinifera wine grapes first made it to Chile in the mid-1500s as part of Spanish efforts to colonize the New World, and among the earliest grapes to arrive was País, a red workhorse of a grape that was widely planted in the Canary Islands, a small chain of islands off the coast of Morocco that were a stopping point for many Spanish voyages to the Americas and where the grape is still planted today, but known as Listán Prieto. It's also known as Criolla in Argentina, and in North America it goes by Mission or Misión in Spanish, because it was an important grape in the production of communion wine by Spanish missionaries in the New World. A quick sidebar about this grape. A lot of research suggests that all of these grapes that I just named are identical genetically and at most might be clonal variations of each other. But some official grape registries do treat them as separate varietals, so you'll hear people talk about them both ways. So pay your money, pick your poor. Getting back to the history, it might have been one thing for colonists to make communion wine, but as far as the Spanish were concerned, it was quite another to make wine of any quality that competed with Spanish imports to the New World. And in the 1600s, the Spanish crown placed a series of restrictions on wine production and export in the American colonies of its empire in order to limit competition with Spanish wines. While some colonies, notably Mexico and Peru, that had burgeoning wine industries of their own, complied with these restrictions, more or less, Chileans would have none of it, and thanks at least in part to their position at one of the far ends of the empire, were largely able to ignore these restrictions and not only keep producing wine for local consumption, but even to export it to other colonies like Peru, all to the chagrin of the Spanish crown and its agents. In the 1800s, Chile experienced another significant moment in its viticultural history when many Chilean wine growers developed an interest in French varietals and began importing cuttings of French vines to Chile. This was fortunate because later in the 1800s, when France was hit by phylloxera and vines there began dying by the score, Chile would become a sort of repository for French vines and varietals, especially those from Bordeaux. Phylloxera, in fact, turned out to be a boon of sorts for Chile because many winemakers in France that were struggling to find work while their vines were dying made their way to Chile where they shared valuable experience and technology with local winemakers. This scenario of hard-hit French winemakers leaving France to ply their trade in the aftermath of phylloxera played itself out all over the wine world. But in contrast to most of those places where phylloxera eventually made its way, Chile has never had phylloxera and to this day remains phylloxera-free, and Chilean vines remain planted on their own roots. So what are the grapes that are happily sitting on their own vines in Chile? Well, País, that workhorse of a Spanish grape, was actually Chile's most important grape from a production standpoint until the end of the 20th century. But as more and more Chilean producers have been working to create wines that can compete in terms of quality with those produced in other wine regions, the importance of this grape, that's never been renowned for its ability to make quality wine, has decreased sharply, and these days there are maybe 10,000 acres of it planted, most of it going to make inexpensive jug wines. Though Chile is a Spanish-speaking country with long cultural and historic links to Spain, thanks to Chile's two-century love affair with French wines, the big dogs in the vineyard are all French varietals, with the biggest of the big dogs being Cabernet Sauvignon, currently planted at around 95,000 acres. There are also significant plantings of Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Merlot, and Syrah. And one Bordeaux varietal, Carmenere, is not only heavily planted at 20,000 acres, but it has a curious backstory. Carmenere is a grape originally from the Bordeaux region of France and has a close relationship to most of the other grapes planted in that area, including what might be called a half-sibling relationship with Merlot, with both of them sharing a parent in Cabernet Franc. When cuttings of Carmenere were brought to Chile from Bordeaux, those cuttings made their way into Chilean vineyards where they were co-planted with and eventually misidentified as Merlot, and then almost forgotten as a separate varietal in Chile. While it might be sad to be forgotten as a varietal, that's not as sad as what happened to it in France, where after phylloxera, many producers decided not to replant it, since it had always been a late-ripening grape and not well suited to Bordeaux's relatively cool climate. As a result, though it's still a permitted grape in Bordeaux reds, very few producers grow it, and it only figures in a very minor way in French winemaking. But in Chile, though misidentified as Merlot, the varietal flourished with lots of plantings throughout the country, particularly in Chile's Central Valley. Yeah, everyone thought it was Merlot, but after years of raised eyebrows from drinkers who thought that this Merlot didn't taste very much like other Merlot, research in 1994 showed that it was in fact Carmenere. Most of the world's Carmenere plantings are now in Chile, and many Chilean winemakers have embraced it and have begun crafting a signature style for the grape in Chile. Finally, Pinot Noir is an up-and-coming grape on the Chilean wine scene, growing well in cool climate regions with little humidity that are found in various parts of the country. Speaking of the various parts of the country, as you can see from the inset map in the upper right, Chile's wine regions only take up a small portion of the entire country. And though Chile itself is around 2,600 miles long, almost all of Chile's wine grapes are grown in a much smaller area, about 550 miles long between the 29th and 37th parallel south. Chile is relatively isolated thanks to the Pacific Ocean on the west, the Andes Mountains on the east, and the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, to the north. And this isolation is thought to be the main reason why Chile has remained phylloxera-free. Chile stretches southward toward Antarctica, and it's from Antarctica that a cold water current, known as the Humboldt Current, flows that has a cooling effect on Chile's coast and its wine regions that are really never very far from the coast. While a cooler climate is a blessing for some varietals, others need warmer temperatures, and though they're not pictured on this map, Chile's coast has a number of hills that shield some areas from the cool temperatures produced by the Humboldt, while valleys between the hills in other areas funnel cool air to some regions, giving Chilean wine country a fair degree of climatic variation and allowing for the planting of a wide number of varietals. In 1995, the various regions that contain Chile's vineyards were formally arranged into a system of Denominaciones de Origen, or Denominations of Origin, or DOs, named for the various valleys that define them, and all contained in 5 broad regions running north and south. Though grapes do grow in the Atacama Desert, the northernmost of these 5 regions, they're mostly grown there as table grapes, or grapes to be used in the production of distilled spirits like pisco. Quality wine doesn't really begin until you hit the Coquimbo region that contains the DOs of Elqui, Limarí, and Choapa. Aconcagua, the next region down, contains the Aconcagua, Casablanca, and San Antonio valleys, with San Antonio containing an important subregion called the Leda Valley. Chile's large Central Valley, or Valle Central, begins with the Maipo Valley, followed by the Rapel Valley, that contains the subzones of Cachapoal and Colchagua. Just to the south of Rapel is the Curicó Valley, with its subzones of Teno and Lontué, followed in turn by the Maule Valley and the Claro, Loncomia, and Tutuven Valley subzones. Finally, the Del Sur region, or the southern region, contains 3 DOs, Itata, Biobío, and Malleco. The laws governing these DOs are very similar to those in the United States, meaning that there are few, if any, restrictions on grape varieties or viticultural and winemaking practices. Though they share a name, Denominación de Origen, with the quality regions of Spain, they're really much more like the AVAs of the United States. Also like the U.S., for varietal wines, Chile follows the so-called Rule of 75, meaning that for a wine to be labeled as a single varietal, say Cabernet Sauvignon or Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, a minimum 75% of the wine in the bottle must be that varietal. The same standard, 75%, holds true for place of origin and vintage designations in Chile, meaning that if a wine says it's from a DO, a minimum 75% of the wine in the bottle must have been grown in that DO. And if a vintage appears on the bottle, 75% of the wine must be from the named year. When it comes to varietal labeling, the European Union is stricter than both Chile and the US, requiring varietally labeled wines to have at least 85% of the named varietal in the bottle. So Chilean varietal wines bound for export usually contain 85% of the named varietal. Varietal wines are a big deal in Chile, though more and more producers are crafting styles based on blends, and about 2/3 of all Chilean wine is exported, making Chile either the fourth or fifth largest exporter of wine in the world, depending on the year. I said at the beginning of this cast that Chile should be on every wine drinker's radar, and that's true for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that as an underappreciated and still developing wine region, it's a great source for remarkable finds at great prices. But like many up-and-coming regions, those bargains can be difficult to sort out from lesser or just not very exciting wines that are still being produced, and it's important to round up as much information as you can when getting ready to buy some bottles. So here are some suggestions to guide your research as you introduce yourself to Chilean wines or just work to broaden your experience with them. First, though País is an historically important grape for Chile, it's never had much of a reputation for producing quality wine. But there are a few producers out there who are working to change that, and if you find varietally labeled País, do some checking to see if the wine you found has some positive buzz about it. It just might. And if you can find it, País has been made very successfully into a sparkling wine by Torres, an important producer from Catalonia in Spain that has been investing heavily in the Chilean wine industry. You should definitely check out Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon. In Chile, it tends to express in a style all its own, with a lot of drinkers and critics noting that at its best, it shows California's vibrant fruit, but has some French restraint that keeps it from getting jammy and over the top. Carmenere is another must-try, and though it deserves a cast on its own, I'll just note here that it produces wines with big cherry, smoke, and spice notes. But, word to the wise, Carmenere is a tricky grape to work with, and if it's not grown and made carefully, you can end up with a wine with overly smoky, even rubbery notes, as well as lots of bell pepper and green vegetable qualities that no one is really very fond of. So do some research before you buy, and note that as a general rule, quality tends to correlate to price when it comes to Chilean Carmenere, so be willing to spend a little extra if you're able. Finally, don't pass up Chilean Pinot Noir. I was skeptical myself until I tried a few examples recommended by someone whose palate I trust, including this little gem from the Casablanca Valley that had a big, expressive nose and palate along with terrific smoothness, all for around $20 American. Win freaking win. Thanks for joining me for another Winecast. I hope to return to Chile at some point in the future with other casts that explore individual regions in greater detail. But until then, I hope this helps give you a sense of what's out there and helps you wet your whistle to try more vino chileno. This cast and a future cast on South African wine are coming at the suggestion of a viewer, so thanks to everyone who's made suggestions or requests, and please keep them coming. I'm your host, the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.